Greetings. Shabbat Shalom. We've had some pretty wet weather here in Central Florida from where I'm speaking. I don't know when you'll hear this message, but obviously I'm giving it on a Sabbath in the middle of the festival of Hanukkah, and it happens to be when I'm giving it on the Roman calendar, December 28th of 2019. And we've had some fairly wet weather here in Central Florida. And speaking of Hanukkah, which is a Jewish holiday, the Jews like to talk about the town of Helm, an Eastern European town where the people were not so clever. A couple of people from Helm were taking a walk. One of them had an umbrella with him. It started to rain. So one fella says to the other, "It's starting to rain. Open up your umbrella." The other fellow says, "It's useless. It's full of holes." So the first fellow says, "Well, then why did you bring it?" So the other fellow says, "How did I know it was going to rain?" Kind of like that story. So this is a Jewish festival that Jesus Christ observed and that Jews continue to observe. And in John 10:22, we read about it. Now it was the Feast of Dedication in Jerusalem, and it was winter. And Jesus walked in the temple in Solomon's porch, as verse 23. That's, the temple would be the center of the action for the observance of Hanukkah, which is the festival commemorating the rededication of the temple back in 164 BC. Today I want to talk about a band of priestly brothers. A band of priestly brothers. So being a priest, a Kohen, I can identify with them, though I don't have the heroism that they had. But I would like to mention that in the Old Covenant, in the time of the Old Testament, there was a menorah. There was a candelabrum that was burning all the time in the temple, and it had 7 branches. And you can read a lot about it in the Old Testament. And it was a symbol of the church of the Old Covenant. And that church was based in one ethnic group, Israel. And so you had all 7 branches coming from the one stem. But that's not the case in the New Testament. In the New Testament, we see that the Church of God begins among the Jews. Then it goes to the Greeks. It goes to the Armenians. It goes into the Balkans. It goes into... in the Middle Ages, it goes into Italy and France, then across to the British Isles. It goes to the U.S. It goes to seems to be based on the west coast of the U.S. and then also in various ethnic groups within the U.S. that were not so well represented in the past and, of course, worldwide. So the church moved around in terms of ethnicity, and so we have 7 separate lampstands. So I want to go to the book of Revelation, talking about the church of God, the church that Jesus Christ established, as he talks about in Matthew 16, "I will build my church." And in Revelation 1, "I was in the Spirit," John says, 1:10. This is 1:10 of Revelation. "I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day," and you could argue, is that a New Testament term for the Sabbath? Or is that another way of talking about the day of the Lord, which is really what the book of Revelation is about? Anyway, "I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day, and I heard behind me a loud voice as of a trumpet, saying, 'I am the Alpha and the Omega, the first and the last. What you see, write in the book and send it to the 7 churches which are in Asia, to Ephesus, to Smyrna, to Pergamos, to Thyatira, to Sardis, to Philadelphia, and to Laodicea.'" So these 7 churches were in effect a composite symbolizing God's church, and each one had strengths and weaknesses, and in effect, they link back to 7 eras of the Old Testament church, as I'm going to point out today. "Then I turned to see the voice that spoke with me, and having turned, I saw 7 golden lampstands." And then, of course, you can go on from there. Jesus Christ is in the midst of them, verse 13. So separate lampstands, because as I said, here the church wasn't in one ethnic group, but it was spiritual Israel, Jews spiritually. Now, I want to talk about the 7 churches on this mail route in what is today Turkey. And as I said, they link back with 7 eras of the Old Testament church. So let's begin. And first we have Ephesus, the church at Ephesus. Now, if you study the scriptures about the church at Ephesus, and then think back to the first way that God worked with the Old Testament church, he worked with different forms of church government. The first was under Moses, Joshua, and the elders. That was one period, very dramatic in terms of what happened. The church was established in a very dramatic way, as it was in New Testament times too. So in any case, we have Moses, Joshua, and the elders. And take a look at the book, at the what is said to the church at Ephesus. You'll see links there. Now we come to the second era, where the church is where the Old Testament congregation or church assembly is ruled by judges, and this was a very difficult period. This was in a way you could say, a bitter period, and that's what Smyrna means. Has to do with being bitter. I think Smyrna is a word for myrrh, and myrrh, although it is used in positive ways, as far as I think to the taste, it has a bitter taste. So I think Smyrna is another word for myrrh, or related to that word. And it was a bitter period, and it was also a very violent period. And it was at that time, the time of the judges, when in the northern kingdom, a kind of counterfeit religion began to develop, which reached its fullest form later, it's true, but it already began to develop in that period. And let's go to Judges 18 at 30, and you'll see an example of that. In Judges 18:30, even though it comes near the end of the book, it's actually early in the history of the judges. And in verse 30 of Judges 18, then the children of Dan, and these people had gone all the way up to the northern part of the country and had taken over an area there. So we talk about from Dan to Beersheba, the northern to southern Israel. So they were up in the northern part. Then the children of Dan set up for themselves the carved image, and Jonathan, the son of Gershom, the son of Manasseh. Now he was a Levite, so now they had their own personal priest. They had their own personal Levite. You can read the background in these 2 chapters, 17 and 18. And if you study into this verse, you'll see that he was the grandson of Moses. He was the son of Gershom, the son of Moses. I don't have time to develop that today, but diligently study verse 30, and you'll see that's what it is. Anyway, so then the children of Dan set up for themselves the carved image, and Jonathan, the son of Gershom, the son of Moses, and his sons were priests to the tribe of Dan until the day of the captivity of the land. So yes, they had Levites, but these Levites were involved in idolatry, and they continued right through, all through the history of ancient Israel. That was going on up in the north there. And now I want to go to 1 Samuel, the 2nd chapter. And here we see tremendous corruption had set in the priesthood itself. And Eli was, of course, a wonderful man, but his sons were not. Samuel served under Eli, and Samuel helped to turn the country around. But in verse 12 of 1 Samuel, the 2nd chapter, we read, "Now the sons of Eli were corrupt. They did not know the Eternal." And I don't want to read any further, and you can go into it. Now, at this time, there was evidently a split, because of the corruption in the priesthood, and some of the Israelites began to develop their own practices separate from what was going on at the main center of worship. And this is what, if you study the history of the Samaritans, this is what you'll read, that the Samaritans claim that their history goes all the way back to the time of Eli, and that could very well be the case. But as you know, the Samaritans have also a more recent heritage, and that is covered in 2 Kings 17. We know that in the 8th century BC, when the northern kingdom was conquered by the Assyrians, they drove out most of that population and forced them to migrate into what is today Iraq and Iran. And then they brought in Babylonians to replace them. And there were some Israelites left in the country, and they mingled with these Babylonians. So we have a mixed race in the north, and it was a mixed religion. They mixed paganism with the religion of the Bible. Now, over time, they tended to get more biblical, I would say, in what they did, but they always remained a kind of counterfeit religion to the north of the Jews who were in the south, exiled from the south, but then came back to the south and reestablished their nation there. And then there was this problem between the Jews and the Samaritans, and the latter books of the Old Testament deal with that issue, and they focus on the fact that God is working through the Davidic monarchy in Jerusalem. He's working through the Aaronic priests and Levites at the temple in Jerusalem. You know, that is where you look for the work of God, even though there's this counterfeit up north. And instead of worshiping on Mount Moriah, they worshipped on Mount Gerizim, or maybe Americans would say Mount Gerizim. So they worshipped there, near the biblical town of Shechem or Shechem, near the modern city of Nablus. That's where the Samaritans, to this day, the few Samaritans who remain, continue to worship there on Mount Gerizim. So we had this issue, and at times the Samaritans were enemies of the Jews and claimed to not be Jewish. At other times, when things were going well for the Jews, they claimed to be Jewish. So they could they could focus on their Gentile heritage when it was to their advantage. They could focus on their Jewish heritage when it was to their advantage. And so, if you go to Revelation 2, when you come to the church at Smyrna, this is the second city, and it's also parallel to the period of the Judges. And so let's take a look at what is said to the church at Smyrna. I'm in Revelation 2:8. And to the angel of the church in Smyrna write, these things says the first and the last, who was dead and came to life. So you see, he's emphasizing that he died and was resurrected, and that he, of course, through him, the saints can be resurrected. And that's a message, because there's a lot of martyrs, let's put it another way. The church at Smyrna, I believe, not only projects back into the past, but projects forward into the future. That is to say, I believe there are 7 stages in the history of the New Testament church, and that these churches are prophetic in terms of showing the dominant characteristic of the church through history. I think nobody can deny there are historical periods with different temperaments that tend to be dominant. The zeitgeist, the spirit of the time. And, we have the Dark Ages, we have the medieval period, we have the Renaissance period, we have the age of discovery and enlightenment, and so forth. We have these various, the age of technology, the Industrial Revolution and the age of technology. So we have, and there are different dominant ways of thinking in different periods in history. And the church has had different dominant characteristics over time. And these 7 churches in Asia Minor, I believe they're real churches, and the issues are real here, but I believe it also projects into the future. I know your works, tribulation and poverty, but you are rich, and I know the blasphemy of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. And this refers, of course, to the church at Smyrna. A couple of things it could refer to. It could refer to Jews who are persecuting the church and therefore not really being good Jews, or it could refer to people who claim to be spiritual Jews. That is to say, people who claim to be the authentic church persecuting true Christians as dissenters, as sectarians, and it goes back to the Samaritan problem, that they claim to be Jews and were not, And then he says, do not fear any of those things which are about to suffer. Indeed, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison, that you may be tested, and you will have tribulation 10 days. Be faithful until death, and I will give you the crown of life. And as I said, this does project into the future. There was a 10-year period of intense persecution on the church from 303 to 313 AD, which ended with Constantine relieving the church, and of course he ultimately, at the end, converted to some form of Christianity. And then it says, "He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches." So obviously, we have to listen to all these messages whenever we live, wherever we live. You can't and I can't help when we were born and where we were born. So we came into the world and grew up with certain influences that have helped to shape us. But nevertheless, these messages are related, important for all of us. And then he says, he who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. He who overcomes shall not be hurt by the second death. Now, if you go back to the book of Judges, I think I want the around the 10th verse or so of Judges, or maybe a little bit later. You'll actually find, I guess it's before you get to the story. I thought it was before you get to the story of Jephthah, but it may actually be earlier than that, before you get to the story of Gideon. And there are several judges who rule during this period, and one of them actually rules for just a 10-year period. So it actually mentions a certain judge that ruled for 10 years. So it does tend to link the book of Judges with that statement in Smyrna, because to the church at Smyrna, because there it talks about it talks about a 10-year period. Here I am. This is Judges 12 verse 11. Okay, just to show you that it's a certain kind of a link, maybe a weak one, but it's a kind of a link. This is Judges 12:11. After him, Elon the Zebulunite judged Israel. He judged Israel 10 years. So it's interesting that both passages, the book of Judges here, 12:11, and Revelation 2 and verse 10, does have this 10-year concept, because as you know, 10 days in prophecy could also be 10 years. There is a principle in the Bible of a day for a year, Numbers 14:34 and Ezekiel 4:6. So the second era is I think, when you read of Smyrna, it does project forward, but it also projects, as I said, back to the time of the judges. The third period, God ruled Israel through the united monarchy, through Saul, David, and Solomon, through the united monarchy. And if you study the church at Pergamos, you'll see how certain references go back to that time in the history of ancient Israel, and also project forward to as the church as it would develop later on in the very early Middle Ages, or late ancient times. And now we go to the fourth period, and in the fourth church is the church at Thyatira, and this projects forward, I believe, to the church in the Middle Ages, but it projects also back to the divided monarchy. At this time, God was ruling over the church through two political entities, Israel to the north, Judah to the south. And both of them could have had the same religion, just as today. There are countries that are separate countries, but they share the same religion. But unfortunately, the kings in the north didn't want to go that route. They insisted on not only being politically separate from Judah, but they wanted to be religiously separate, which was a terrible error on their part. But anyway, so one thing it did preserve God's way of life in Judah. Perhaps had the nation stayed together, the whole nation would have apostatized. But the fact that Judah was distinct, God's way of life was kept alive in the south. But in any case, the divided monarchy, if you read the material about Thyatira, it'll remind you of that history. Now we come to the fifth period, and here we have the church at Sardis. Now, if you go back in terms of the Old Testament, you do have a Sardis era in the Old Testament. So you could call these people the Old Testament sardines. So here we have the Sardis church in the Old Testament, and here they were under the Medo-Persian Empire, and they were autonomous in the land of Israel, but they had to give tribute to the Persian Empire. So they were ruled by governors, who were also tax collectors for the Persians. But they did have the Old Covenant in effect in the land of Israel. This was the period, as you know, of Nehemiah and Ezra and Malachi. And so it ties in with what you read about with the church at Sardis. And I believe you can project forward into the 17th century in terms of the and later as you talk about Sardis in terms of prophecy. And now we come to the focus today. We come to the band of priestly brothers. Here was a crisis in the history of God's church because Antiochus Epiphanes was trying to wipe out the Old Covenant, particularly in the land of Israel itself, trying to fully assimilate the church, not through genocide, but through assimilation. And so we had a small group led by the Maccabees. Mattathias begins the process, a priest living away from Jerusalem now in the town of Modi'in, and his 5 sons, Simon, Eliezer, Judah, Jonathan, and John, the 5, Shimon, Eliezer, Yehudah, Yochanan, and Yehonatan, so they are called the Maccabees. They're from the Hasmonean dynasty, the Hasmonean family. They did establish a dynasty. There are various theories as to why they were called Maccabees. There are, of course, books of Maccabees that some of you, if you depending what Bible you have, you may have First and Second Maccabees in your Bible. But anyway, they are in effect the Philadelphians of ancient times. Of Old Testament times. Philadelphia is brotherly love, and they are the Church of Philadelphia has that characteristic of brotherly love. And if you go back to the Maccabees, they are called saints in the history of Israel, in the history of the Jews. They're called the Hasidim, the saints, and Hasidim are people who have the characteristic of Chesed, loving kindness. So these are the people who had loving kindness, and they were the ones who were zealous for God's way of life. And they were, as I said, the 6th era of God's Old Testament church. You had Moses, and Joshua and the elders. You had judges. You had the united monarchy, the divided monarchy, the governors who were tax collectors. And now you had priest kings. Now you had priests who temporarily took upon themselves the title of king until the Messiah should come. They became kings and priests. So let's see what it says about the church at Philadelphia. But first, let's go back and see what was done by this band of priestly brothers. They gathered together around them an army of saints who threw off the yoke of Antiochus Epiphanes and cleansed the temple and rededicated the temple on December 14th of 164 BC, which was the 25th of Kislev. And 3 years earlier, on the 25th of Kislev, it had been defiled by Antiochus Epiphanes, celebrating a kind of proto-Christmas holiday, I believe. Anyway, I want to go back to Daniel 8. And here we have a prophecy. Believe it or not, well, you know the Bible well enough to know that the festival of Hanukkah is not mentioned in the Old Testament. Ironically, it's mentioned in the New Testament, but it's prophesied in the Old Testament. And in Daniel 8, verse 13, "Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to that certain one who was speaking, How long will division be concerning the daily sacrifices and the transgression of desolation, the giving of both the sanctuary and the host to be trampled underfoot? And he said to me, For 2,300 days." Oh, this is evening morning, Adev Boker. Evening morning what? Evening morning sacrifices. So it's 1,150 days. It's 2,300 evening and morning sacrifices. "And he said to me, For 2,300 days, then the sanctuary shall be cleansed." And so there were 47 days when the sacrifices were prohibited, and then 1,103 days from the time of the abomination of desolation until the cleansing. Then we go to Daniel 11, And the prophecy there talks about the abomination of desolation, and then it talks about what the Maccabees did afterwards, and I'll jump to there. Verse 32 of Daniel 11, those who do wickedly against the covenant he shall corrupt with flattery, Antiochus, he shall corrupt with flattery, but the people who know their God shall be strong and carry out exploits. These were people who had just a little strength. They were a guerrilla band against a mighty army, but they had faith, they had courage, they had zeal, and God gave them the victory. And in Revelation 3, and to the angel of the church in Philadelphia write, these things says he who is holy, who is true, who has the key of David, who opens and no man shuts, and shuts and no man opens. So they understood that they were not going to be kings forever, that ultimately it would be a Davidic monarch, but they took the role of king temporarily, priest and king. I know your works. See, I have set before you an open door, and no one can shut it, for you have a little strength, have kept my word, and have not denied my name. Many Jews in the English-speaking world sing a song where they say, and your word broke their sword when our own strength failed us. Some of you have heard that version of the song. Verse 9, and indeed I will make those of the synagogue of Satan who say they are Jews and are not, but lie. Indeed I will make them come and worship before your feet, and to know that I have loved you. The Jews finally solved the Samaritan problem during the period of the Hasmonean dynasty. Under John Hyrcanus, they conquered the Samaritans, destroyed the temple on Mount Gerizim, and forcibly converted many of the Samaritans. They also expanded down into Edom and forcibly converted the Edomites, the Idumeans, and of course from there came Herod. So maybe that was a bad deal there. But I'm not endorsing necessarily forced conversions. What I'm saying is, politically speaking, geopolitically speaking, the Maccabees were a people who had very small strength but became a powerful nation and actually absorbed new nations into their identity. They, in effect, expanded the Jewish people at that time, both politically and even population-wise, demographically. So it was a type of what Philadelphia would accomplish. The small church, Philadelphia church, in terms of prophecy, would be a small group that would add many to God's church. And of course, ultimately in the millennium, even more for that matter. But anyway, he goes on to say, because you have kept my command to persevere, I also will keep you from the hour of trial, which will come upon the whole world to test those who dwell on the earth. Behold, I am coming quickly. Hold fast what you have, that no one may take your crown. And this, of course, is more of a prophetic matter. But in terms of the situation with the Hasmoneans and that sixth era of God's church, it was the era before the time that Christ actually did come the first time. So in a way, he was going to come relatively quickly. When you look at the whole span of history, he came during the seventh era of the Old Testament church, when it was run by the scribes and Pharisees. Eventually, the church was taken over by the Roman Empire and ceased to be a political power. It became a religious people ruled by scribes and Pharisees. But the worst tragedies that occurred to the Jewish people occurred then, not at the time of the Maccabees. So the Maccabees were spared, as he says, I'm going to keep you from the hour of trial. The Maccabees were not there for the disasters that occurred later. That came at the time of the scribes and Pharisees. So I want to mention that there was a time in the 19th century when the British Empire was developing to develop, to at its height, and it was the Victorian period, and at that time there were a lot of great reform movements that took place, great zeal in the English-speaking world, and at that time there were Sabbath-keeping churches that spread, even though they were not major powerful churches, but they spread God's word all around the world. And you had people in South America and in India and I think even in China at times, and Africa and other parts of the world that actually began to hear the authentic gospel from that particular group. And that group began to pretty much wind down before the First World War and all the troubles that occurred after that time. And so they represent, in effect, a prophetic fulfillment. But the Maccabees of the period a century and a half before Christ, they are, in effect, a type of this church in Philadelphia that's covered here. So as we are in this season of Hanukkah, as we're in the Sabbath during the festival of Hanukkah, we can be inspired, whether or not we're observing the festival, but we can be inspired by that aspect, by that moment in church history when a small group became extremely zealous and developed the people of Israel once again into a world power, as they had been under David and Solomon. They didn't get quite that powerful, but they did develop into an independent regional power at that time, and they also preserved the old covenant and decisively overcame the effort to forcibly assimilate them into the world culture as a whole, to Hellenize them. They remained a distinct people faithful to the old covenant. So they had a tremendous zeal, and therefore there's whatever flaws there may be there, we can certainly be inspired by their example. Now, we are a nonviolent people, but we can at the same time, as the book of Ephesians tells us, we can wage spiritual war with the zeal of the Maccabees. I want to finish by going to what Paul wrote to the church at Galatia, Galatians 6 and verse 9. So as we study the history of this period, whether or not we observe this festival, as I am, I need to be observing it as with a Jewish background. A lot of you don't necessarily need to be observing it. I've got nothing against your doing it either, though, for that matter. But whether you're observing it or not, but you should be aware of the history of the period, because it is part of church history. But we can also then be inspired by the example of the Maccabees. And in Galatians 6:9, Paul tells us, "And let us not grow weary while doing good, for in due season we shall reap if we do not lose heart." As I finish, I want to tell you there's good news about the Ramos family from the Church of God Seventh-day in Colorado Springs. Things seem to be working out well for them and for their child yet unborn. However, now there's another family in that same congregation that is having issues, and this is now Jessica Baxter. She is having very serious problems with the yet unborn Reagan. And so she and Reagan, her yet unborn, need your prayers at this time. So please be praying for Jessica Baxter and her yet unborn child, Reagan. And we pray that if you're celebrating Hanukkah, you have a very wonderful Hanukkah. And if you're seeing this on the Sabbath, that you're having a very wonderful Sabbath. Whenever you happen to be seeing this, all the best to you and yours.